At some point in the last 2,000 years, a group of people gathered in a room, picked up ordinary bread and ordinary wine, and did something that no one had ever quite done before. They said that the bread was a body, that the wine was blood, that consuming them was not symbolic of a relationship with the divine, but was, in some sense, that theologians would spend 15 centuries arguing about the actual thing itself. This ritual has been repeated more times than any other act in Western history, more than any prayer, more than any law, more than any king's decree. Every Sunday, across 6 continents, in cathedrals and living rooms and underground churches and prison chapels, someone picks up bread and wine and says the same words that were said in that first room. It has also caused more conflict than almost any other question in Western Christianity. It divided a unified church into fragments. It justified executions. It produced wars. It separated families at the same table where the ritual was supposed to unite them. And it has attracted theories, ranging from the historically documented to the genuinely provocative to the purely speculative, about what it really is, where it really came from, and what has really been done with it. This is the history of the Eucharist, and the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what was already happening in that room before Jesus said anything new. The Last Supper was a Passover Seder. This is not a minor detail. The Seder was, and remains, one of the most precisely structured ritual meals in human history. Every element has a name, a meaning, a text to accompany it, a memory embedded in it across generations. The unleavened bread called matzah commemorates the bread baked in desperate haste by Israelites who had no time to let dough rise before fleeing Egypt. The bitter herbs represent the bitterness of slavery lived for 400 years. The 4 cups of wine correspond to 4 specific divine promises of liberation spoken in the book of Exodus. The Passover lamb that had been sacrificed at the temple that afternoon was on the table. Every bite was a memory. Every sip was a promise. Jesus and his disciples were not inventing a new ritual from nothing. They were sitting inside a ritual that already carried centuries of accumulated theological weight, doing something that every Jewish family in Jerusalem was doing that same night. The disciples around that table had done this every year since childhood. The words were familiar. The gestures were familiar. The meanings were familiar. And then, in the middle of that existing and ancient structure, Jesus picked up one of the ritual elements, the unleavened bread, and said words that had never been part of the Seder, had never been part of any Seder. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then the 3rd cup, the cup of redemption that was already part of the existing ritual. He reframed it entirely. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. What did he mean? That question has produced more theological argument, more printed pages, more ecclesiastical conflict, and more bloodshed than almost any other sentence in human history. And the honest answer, after 15 centuries of sustained and serious debate, is that the text itself does not definitively resolve it. The language supports multiple readings simultaneously, which is precisely why multiple readings have survived with equal conviction in people of equal intelligence and sincerity. Did he mean the bread literally becomes his body and the wine literally becomes his blood? Did he mean it symbolically, the way the Passover lamb symbolically represents the redemption from Egypt? Did he mean something in between? A real presence that is not identical to physical flesh and blood. The language works in all 3 directions, which is why all 3 directions were eventually chosen by different parts of the tradition that grew from that room. But before the argument started, there was a simpler and stranger story, because the ritual of a sacred meal that unites the worshipper with a divine being through consumption of that being's substance was not unique to Christianity, and this is where the history begins to get genuinely complicated. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation, occupied a specific and unusual place in the Greek religious imagination. Other gods were worshipped with offerings, with sacrifice sent upward from below. Dionysus was fundamentally different. In the ecstatic rites associated with his worship, the worshippers did not send something to the god. They consumed him. The wine was not merely offered to Dionysus as a tribute. The wine was Dionysus. Drinking the wine was drinking the god. Becoming intoxicated was, in the theological logic of the Dionysian tradition, a form of being filled by the divine presence, of temporary union with the god. Through the act of consumption, the boundary between worshipper and worshipped dissolved, at least temporarily, in the act of drinking. The cult of Mithras, which spread through the Roman military in the same centuries that Christianity was spreading through the Roman civilian population, also had a sacred communal meal as one of its central rituals. Initiates gathered, ate bread, and drank wine in a ceremony that ancient critics noted bore uncomfortable resemblance to the Christian Eucharist. Early Christian apologists explained this as diabolical imitation. Others explained it as independent development of a universal human religious pattern. The evidence for direct influence in either direction has never been found. The Eleusinian mysteries, the most prestigious and longest-lasting of the Greek mystery cults, involved initiates consuming a sacred drink, the kaikion, as the climax of a ritual journey through death and rebirth. Whatever was in that drink, and whatever the initiates experienced, the structure was consistent. Union with the divine through consumption of a sacred substance at the peak of a transformative ritual. The parallels to the Eucharist run through all of these traditions, and they have been noted by scholars, by critics, and by believers for centuries. The question of which direction influence traveled, or whether any of it was direct borrowing as opposed to independent expression of a deep human religious impulse, remains genuinely open. What is not open is the observation that the pattern existed widely in the religious world that early Christianity was born into and spread through. The first Christians were not emerging into a cultural vacuum. They were moving through a world that already had powerful frameworks for understanding the consumption of a divine substance as a path to union with the divine. Now, for the part of the story that most people who grew up in a church were never told directly, though it is documented in sources available to anyone who looks. In the year 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council, the same council that made annual auricular confession mandatory for all Catholics, the same council whose decisions shaped the daily texture of religious life in Europe for 3 centuries. Among the council's many declarations was the formal definition of a doctrine that had been developing for centuries, but had never been officially codified: transubstantiation. The doctrine stated, in precise philosophical language drawn from Aristotle's Metaphysics, that during the Mass, the substance of the bread and the substance of the wine are entirely converted into the substance of the body and blood of Christ. The accidents, the visible, tastable, smellable, touchable qualities of the elements remain those of bread and wine, but the underlying metaphysical reality, the substance, in the Aristotelian sense, becomes Christ's body and blood. This is a very specific and very technical claim. It is not simply saying that Christ is present in the Eucharist. It is saying that the bread ceases to be bread at the level of its deepest reality and becomes something else entirely, even as it continues to appear and taste exactly as it did before. The implications of this doctrine, beyond the theological ones, are worth sitting with carefully. If the priest has the power, through his ordained status and the specific words of consecration, to transform the substance of bread into the literal body of God and the substance of wine into the literal blood of God, then the priest is not merely a teacher, a community leader, a moral guide, or a preacher. He is someone who does something that no ordinary human being can do, that no amount of personal holiness or sincerity of faith can replicate without ordination, that requires a specific chain of authorized transmission reaching back unbroken to the apostles. He is, in the most literal sense imaginable, the person without whom God's physical presence cannot enter the community. Several historians who study this period in detail have noted that the formal definition of transubstantiation arrives at a specific moment in institutional history. The 12th and 13th centuries were a period of significant challenge to clerical authority from multiple directions. Popular religious movements questioning the need for priestly mediation, theological disputes about the nature of church authority, political conflicts between the papacy and secular rulers. By making the Eucharist philosophically dependent on a specific theory, of ordained priestly power. The Fourth Lateran Council simultaneously made the central ritual of Christian life doctrinally exclusive to those the institution authorized to perform it. This is not to say the doctrine was invented for purely political reasons. The theological arguments for it were serious and had been developing for centuries before 1215. But doctrines do not develop in isolation from the institutional contexts that define and defend them, and the timing, the precise definition, the philosophical specificity, and the institutional consequences of this particular doctrine are worth noting clearly. Who controls the body of God controls access to the body of God. The use of that control was not always subtle. Excommunication, the denial of the Eucharist and all other sacraments, was the most powerful disciplinary weapon in the institutional church's arsenal, and it was wielded not only for spiritual reasons. King Henry IV of Germany, in 1076, found himself excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII in a dispute over who had the authority to appoint bishops. The practical consequences were immediate. His nobles were released from their oaths of loyalty. He was politically isolated. He could not govern effectively while cut off from the sacraments. The following winter, he stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle at Canossa for 3 days, in penitential dress, waiting for the Pope to lift the excommunication. Pope Innocent III used the interdict, a collective punishment suspending all sacramental life, including the Eucharist in an entire territory, as a political weapon. England was placed under interdict from 1208 to 1214 during a dispute with King John. For 6 years, no Mass was celebrated, no marriages were blessed, no last rites were administered, no Christian burial was permitted in one of the most Christian nations in Europe. The pain was deliberately and widely inflicted as a bargaining position in a political negotiation. The body of God was a hostage in a territorial dispute. When Martin Luther nailed his thesis to the door at Wittenberg in 1517, his objections began with indulgences, but the deeper argument was about the architecture of mediation. Who stands between the human being and God? By what authority and with what power? The Eucharist was at the center of this battle because it was at the center of everything. Luther himself still believed in what he called the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but he rejected the Aristotelian philosophical framework of transubstantiation as an unscriptural philosophical imposition. You cannot find the word substance in its Aristotelian sense anywhere in the Bible, he argued, and the Church has no authority to require belief in a philosophical framework beyond what Scripture teaches. His own position, sometimes called consubstantiation, though he did not use that term, held that Christ's body and blood were present in, with, and under the bread and wine, without the bread and wine ceasing to be bread and wine. Ulrich Zwingli, reforming simultaneously in Zurich, went substantially further. He read the words, "This is my body," as a figure of speech, meaning this represents or signifies my body. The Eucharist, in Zwingli's reading, was a memorial, a genuinely significant and communal one, but not an event in which any transformation of substance occurred, literal or otherwise. Christ was not physically or spatially present in the bread and wine. The faithful received him through faith and remembrance, not through the elements themselves. John Calvin occupied a carefully constructed middle position. He rejected both transubstantiation and Zwingli's pure memorialism. He held that Christ was truly present in the Eucharist, but spiritually rather than physically, and that this spiritual presence was genuine and not merely psychological. The faithful communicant truly received Christ, but through the operation of the Holy Spirit, not through any physical transformation of the elements. These distinctions, which can appear to be hair-splitting to a modern reader, unfamiliar with the context, were understood by the people arguing about them as questions of eternal significance on which everything else depended. In October 1529, Philip of Hesse convened the Colloquy of Marburg in an attempt to unite the Protestant movement against a common Catholic adversary. Luther and Zwingli sat across a table from each other for 3 days. They agreed on 14 out of 15 articles of doctrine. On the 15th, they could not move each other. Luther reportedly drew a cloth over the table, wrote "Hoc est corpus meum" in chalk on the wood beneath, and pointed to it as a declarative conclusion. The words say, "This is." It means, "This is." Zwingli produced the text from John chapter 6, where Jesus says, "My flesh is of no avail, and it is the Spirit that gives life," as evidence that Jesus himself had clarified the figurative meaning. Neither persuaded the other. Philip of Hesse's attempt at Protestant unity failed at the table of the Lord's Supper. The fractures opened at Marburg produced the denominational diversity of Protestantism that still exists today. Lutheran and Reformed Christians still cannot commune together at each other's tables in many traditions, 500 years later, because of a dispute about the meaning of 6 words spoken in a room in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. This is not a trivial historical detail. It is evidence of how much weight human beings have been willing to place on this particular ritual and this particular question. Now here is what every version of the Eucharist, across the entire spectrum of this debate, has in common. And it is the thing that may matter most. Every version involves gathering around a table, taking up ordinary food and drink, and asserting that through this specific act, in this specific community, something happens that connects the human participants to the divine. The debate is about the mechanism. The shared assumption beneath every version is that this is the mechanism, that this table, this bread, this cup, this community is the location of the encounter. But several strands of early Christian and mystical thinking, strands that were consistently marginalized by official theology, suggested something much more radical, that the Eucharist is not the location of the encounter. It is a pointer to the nature of all encounter. The mystical theologian Meister Eckhart described the soul's union with God in terms that made the institutional Eucharist seem like one specific, limited expression of something that was always and everywhere available. For Eckhart, the divine birth in the soul was not reserved for Sunday mornings and authorized spaces with authorized personnel. It was the continuous reality of a soul that had learned to be still enough to receive what was always being offered. What this strand of thinking suggests, taken to its conclusion, is that the Eucharist is a ritual enactment of something that is happening everywhere and always, the divine reaching toward the human in the most ordinary possible material forms, seeking to be received, seeking to be incorporated, seeking not to be worshipped from a distance, but to be taken in. Bread and wine were the most ordinary things in that world, the food of every household, the drink of every table, the radical claim of the Eucharist. Beneath all the doctrinal architecture built on top of it is that the divine presence chooses the most ordinary thing as its vehicle. Not gold, not incense, not elaborate ceremony requiring specialized personnel. Bread, wine, the things already on the table. Now, I want to know what you actually think about all of this. 5 theories have run through this history, and they are genuinely incompatible with each other in important ways. The first, the Eucharist is exactly what the Catholic Church has always said it is. A literal transformation of substance through ordained priestly power, a miracle that occurs at every valid Mass, regardless of the holiness or sinfulness of the priest performing it. The second, it is a powerful and communal memorial, a symbolic act of gathering around the memory of Christ that has profound meaning for the community of faith, but involves no supernatural change in the elements themselves. The third, it is a genuine spiritual encounter with Christ's presence, mediated through the elements without requiring their literal physical transformation, available to the faithful through faith and the action of the Spirit. The fourth, it is a ritual that absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, patterns from the mystery cults and sacred meal traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world, and its power draws partly from those older wells of human religious experience. The fifth, it is an institution that was developed theologically in ways that served specific power interests at specific historical moments, and the spiritual reality it points toward, the availability of the divine in the most ordinary material of everyday life, does not require the institutional structure that was built around it. Or maybe you have a 6th position that none of these capture. Maybe you hold 2 of them simultaneously and find them more complementary than contradictory. Maybe you have spent time inside one of these positions and found it inadequate, and your own story of moving between them is more interesting than any of the official options. The comments are yours. Which of these makes the most sense to you? Or what have you seen or experienced or concluded that this history hasn't touched? I am asking because the most honest and interesting conversations about the Eucharist I have ever encountered have happened not in theology classrooms, but in places exactly like this one, where people with real experience of these questions speak honestly about what they actually think. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, the willingness to sit with the hard questions rather than settling for easy answers, the ebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, was written for exactly that kind of seeker, not to provide the official conclusion, but to open the interior space where your own genuine encounter with the divine can actually begin. The link is in the description. And one final thought, regardless of where you land on any of the theological questions, whatever you believe about what happens to the bread and the wine, there is something in the Eucharist that no amount of theological argument has ever fully explained or argued away. The stubborn, recurring, apparently ineradicable human insistence on bringing the divine into the body, not contemplating it from a respectful distance, not reasoning toward it through argument, eating it. That insistence is older than Christianity. It appears in the Dionysian mysteries, and in the Passover lamb, and in the Eleusinian mysteries, and in the communion meals of traditions that had no contact with each other. It is, in every case, the same theological statement expressed in the same physical gesture, that the divine and the human are not meant to remain separate, that the direction of the sacred is always toward incorporation, toward intimacy, toward the closing of the distance that every human being seems to feel in every culture without being taught to feel it. What that means about the nature of God and the nature of you is the question this ritual has been asking for 2,000 years. Maybe the fact that we are still asking it is the most honest answer we have.